Hello Padawans, this is the second part of the 1.1 notes on the nature of science. I'm doing something a little bit different this time. I'm using a system called Loom, which allows me to display the notes a little bit easier and still be able to discuss the notes with you. If it looks like I'm not staring at the camera, it's because I'm looking at the class that's in here in my classroom. So hopefully this works out a little bit better. We'll keep on trying new things until we figure out what works the best. So last time we left off right about here, where we were talking about our hypotheses. Remember, our hypothesis is an educated guess. This is the possible solution, the answer to your question. It is your prediction. But what makes something a hypothesis and not just a prediction is that it has to be testable. We need to be able to test this hypothesis with an experiment. Okay? So a good hypothesis is based on observation and research. So we did a little bit of research, that's step 2 of the scientific method, and then maybe based on observation, things that we see in nature, or just ideas that we know from previous experimentation that we've already done. Okay, we can say, okay, here's a reasonable idea, a reasonable hypothesis to answer my question, to solve my problems. Okay. So today we're going to be talking a lot about how do we actually go about testing these ideas. And this involves what we call experimental design. Okay, this is how we actually develop the test that's going to test our hypothesis. Now, there's quite a few things that we need to keep in mind when we are designing an experiment. Okay. Generally, what we're looking for are experimental results that are going to be reliable and valid. Okay, so 2 things that we think about when we're designing an experiment is the reliability of the experiment and the validity of the experiment. Okay. And one of the ways that we ensure this is by making sure we have clear step-by-step procedures. So remember when we were using scientific inquiry, we came up with an idea, we had a problem, we came up with an idea, then we just kind of jumped in to try to solve that idea. Inquiry doesn't take a tremendous amount of planning necessarily, and you don't necessarily have to have a play-by-play ready to go. You can just dive in and say, okay, we'll just make it up as we go along. But with scientific method, we want to make sure that our procedures are far more clearly defined. Okay, we want to have a step-by-step instruction manual because we want to be able to repeat this experiment over and over and over again. Okay? And this is what's going to lead us to reliability and validity. Okay. So when we're talking about reliability, what we're talking about is the degree to which an experiment produces stable and consistent results. Okay? So think about it. If something is reliable, what does that mean? It means that you can count on it. If you know a person and that person is reliable and that person says, you know what, I'll show up at 10 o'clock, then you can count on the fact that they will be there at 10 o'clock. If you know someone that is unreliable and they say, yeah, I'll be there at 10 o'clock, you're going to sit there and go, yeah, right, they're telling me 10, but I know this guy, they're going to show up at like 11:15. Because they're unreliable, or they won't show up at all because they'll forget that they were supposed to be somewhere. So in science, we want experiments that are reliable. We want to be able to get the same results every time we do that test. And that's one of the reasons why we write out step-by-step procedures, is we want to make sure that we can follow the same guide every time. And it doesn't matter who the scientist is, we want to be able to follow the same experiment. So you want to write your procedures if you're designing an experiment so that any scientist can come along and do the exact same thing you did. Okay. So when we think about reliability, okay, let's say we do an experiment. Let's say we're growing flowers, okay, and I'm testing some new fertilizer I designed. Okay. If I do a test and I get a measurement of these flowers grew 10 centimeters, okay, and then I do the same test over again, following the exact same procedures, but this time my flowers grow 20 centimeters. Okay? That's not very reliable, okay, because I got totally different results each time. Okay? So if I did that experiment properly, or if I designed the experiment properly, then I should be getting around the same results each time. Okay? Now, if my results are way off, then I have to ask myself, did I do something wrong? Okay, is my experiment reliable? Did I follow the procedures correctly? Did something change in between? So you have to think about these things as you're running experiments. And scientists do this all the time because they know if I'm going to make this really extraordinary claim of this is some great science that I did, other scientists are going to want you to prove it. They're going to say, let me see your experimental design. Let me see the procedures you followed. Let me make sure that the experiment you did is reliable. And then in many cases, other scientists are going to test it themselves. Say, we're not going to take you for your word. We're going to go about and we're going to try it on our own and see if we get the same reliable results. Okay. Now, something that scientists do to ensure the reliability of their experiments is they include multiple trials. A trial consists of your experiment from beginning to end. Okay. So we do your trial once. So we're following the step-by-step procedures, A through J, let's say. Okay, there's 10 steps in your procedure, so A through J. Okay, we're going to follow those step by step. That's one trial. Okay. Then what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the beginning, step A, and we're going to follow it all the way through again. That's going to be your second trial. So we're going to repeat that multiple times because the more times we repeat those trials, the more data we're going to have, the higher the reliability we're going to have. Now, some experiments can take a long time to complete. There are some experiments that can take days, weeks, even years to finish. So if I have an experiment that's going to take me 365 days, an entire year to complete, okay, I don't necessarily want to wait an entire year to start the next trial to collect the next batch of data. So what sometimes scientists do is they will run trials concurrently, meaning they'll run multiple trials at the same time. So I might have trial 1, and then at the same time I'm also running trial 2, and then maybe trial 3 and 4 at the same time as well. Okay, because the more data we collect, the more reliable our results are going to be. Because if each trial keeps on giving us the same results, then we can say, yeah, I think we have something right here. Okay. So the other factor that we need to keep in mind is what we call validity. Now, validity is a little bit more complicated. Okay. This is the degree to which scientific experiments actually measure what you set out to measure, or how well it reflects the reality of the claims. Okay. So there's two parts to validity. The first part is, does my experiment actually measure what I wanted it to measure? So a valid experiment. So let's say, again, we're back to growing flowers. Okay. So if I'm putting flowers in a garden and I'm watering those flowers and I'm putting new fertilizer on it, but in the process, it rains. We live in Florida. There's a hurricane. Okay. Rabbits come along and they start digging up my garden. Okay. And then you get results. Okay, so what you might ask is, how valid are those results? Because, we had a hurricane and we had rabbits digging around. Okay, did my experiment actually measure what it was that I was trying to measure? Or did all those other things disrupt my experiment? Or let's say I'm trying to measure the growth of flowers, but I'm growing them in my bedroom. Is that the best environment to grow flowers? Maybe not. So you can ask yourself, are my results valid? Okay. So did my experiment actually measure what I expected it to measure? Okay. The other thing is, how well does my results reflect reality? Okay. What we know to be true. Now this gets a little bit trickier because now we have to compare the results of our experiment to what we already know about the world and about nature around us. And that includes what other people have found through their experiments. So if I'm growing flowers, okay, and my flowers are for some reason growing sideways, okay, that doesn't really reflect reality. Most flowers don't grow sideways. There are some occasions where they'll grow sideways, but that's more an exception than it is what we typically see. So if we're looking at the results of our experiment, we can ask ourselves, well, how well does this experiment match with everything else we know about growing flowers? Okay. And if they're totally different, then we have to ask ourselves, did we do a valid experiment? Okay, if there's wild results that we didn't anticipate or are nowhere near what we thought were going to happen, then we may be questioning the validity of that experiment. Now, on occasion, scientists will come up with some really wild ideas and they'll do tests, and those ideas seem to be accurate. And other scientists will come along and say, did you do a valid experiment? And if we can back that up, we can say, yes, look at what I did. Here's the procedures I followed. Here's the reliability of the results. Okay, then you might change the way that we look at things. Okay, it doesn't happen often, but it has happened in the past where scientists have come up with brand new wild ideas, and we find that it's true. Okay? And we remember the names of those scientists that do that. People like Sir Isaac Newton, people like Albert Einstein, people like Dr. Stephen Hawking. These are people that came up with wild ideas in the realm of physics. And at the time, these were weird and different, but as their evidence started to pile up, we're like, you know what? These guys, they're crazy, but they're right. Okay? So it's important to question the validity of experiments, but then when the evidence seems to back it up, now it's time to say, well, you know what? Maybe they were right. Okay. So a way that we can look at validity versus reliability is think about a target. So imagine we're like shooting a bow and arrow. Okay. So your goal is to hit the center of the target, right? So in the first diagram here on the left, okay, we're hitting the target, and we're hitting the target in the same spot over and over and over again, but we're not hitting the center. Okay, so these results would be reliable because we're constantly getting the same results, but they're not very valid because our goal is to hit the center of the target, and we're not doing that. Okay. The next diagram is showing where we're hitting the target, but we're all over the place. Okay, we're not really hitting in the same spot over and over. This is not very reliable results because our measurements, our target here, is all over the place. Okay. Now we have some that are hitting near the center, so it's kind of valid, but it's not very reliable. And then the next diagram is showing something that is neither reliable nor valid. So we're hitting all over the target, but we're not really hitting the center of the target. Okay. So the final diagram on the right there, this is where all the shots are hitting in the middle of the target. Okay. That is both reliable and valid because we're hitting the same spot over and over and over again, and we're hitting where we want to hit. Okay. And if you know anything about shooting a bow and arrow or shooting guns or anything like that, to hit the target reliably, consistently at the center of the target, it takes practice. It takes some skill. Okay? And sometimes it takes the right equipment. Because if you have a bow and arrow that is kind of wonky, it's not going to shoot straight, regardless of how good of an archer you are. And the same thing with a gun. Okay, so this is true in science as well. Sometimes we need the correct equipment. We need the right skill set in order to get experiments that are both reliable and valid. Okay. So here's the next formative question. And this is dealing with Donna the bearded dragon. This was our pet at home. She passed away this summer. It's sad. But Donna the bearded dragon is observed eating lettuce. I conclude that all bearded dragons like to eat lettuce. How can I increase the reliability of my conclusion? So I have a conclusion, but I want to make sure that this conclusion is reliable. Okay. So A, I can measure the amount of lettuce that Donna eats. B, I can test to see if Donna will eat other vegetables. C, I can count the number of vegetables other bearded dragons eat. Or D, test to see if other bearded dragons will eat lettuce. All right. So, other factors to keep in mind as we are designing our experiment, like the actual nut and bolts of putting together an experiment. First of all, we want to make sure that we only have a single variable, okay, when we are designing our experiment. Okay. That experiment, anything that can affect the results is what we call a variable. So again, if we're growing flowers, what affects the growth of flowers? Well, the soil that it's growing in, the amount of sunlight that it gets on a daily basis, the amount of water it gets, other factors like whether or not it's being munched on by caterpillars. Okay, so all of those things can affect the growth of a flower. Okay, so all of those are variables. So when we're designing an experiment, what we want to do is we want to manipulate one of those variables. We're going to change one thing about those flowers. Okay, but everything else we want to keep the same. And the reason for that is we want to make sure that our results are based on that one thing we were changing and not other factors that we didn't take into account. Okay. So that one thing that we change is what we call an independent variable. This is also sometimes referred to as the manipulated variable, okay, because it's the thing that we're changing. We're manipulating it. Okay. So if we're growing some flowers and we have a brand new fertilizer that we want to use. So we're going to change the fertilizer that these flowers get. So that's going to be our independent variable. It's going to be our manipulated variable. Okay. So the hope is by making that one change, we're going to see some changes to the results, okay, as opposed to growing those flowers without, say, this new fertilizer. Okay. What happens as a result of that change is what we call the dependent variable, or also known as the responding variable. Now, it is very, very easy to mix up independent variable versus dependent variable. So we need to make sure that we keep those terms straight. So if you can kind of remember independent manipulated versus dependent responding, it's a little bit easier to remember those. So your independent variable, that's the thing that you're changing. The dependent variable, that's the response you get from the change. So if I add fertilizer to these flowers, I would expect there to be a change as a result. So I would hope maybe the flowers would grow taller or faster. Okay. So another way of thinking about your dependent variable is this is the factor that you're going to measure during the experiment. So if I'm growing flowers in a garden, then maybe I'm measuring how tall the flowers are. Okay. Now, in any given experiment, scientists can measure many things. So if I'm growing flowers, I might measure how tall they are, I might measure how wide they are, I might measure the color, are they nice and green? I might count the number of blossoms that each flower has. Okay, all of those things are important data that a scientist could collect. But they're always going to rely on one factor to be, this is my dependent variable. This is the one thing that I'm looking for especially. All the other data is important because that can inform about the results of your experiment. So let's say I'm using this brand new fertilizer and my flowers grow really tall, but they're all brown and wilted. Like, well, that's not what flowers are supposed to look like. So yeah, they're tall, but they're not really healthy looking. So maybe this fertilizer isn't really doing what I expect it to do. So you have your independent variable, the thing you're changing. You have your dependent variable, the thing you're measuring. How do you know what the results of your experiment mean? This is where we need something called a control. Your control is your standard for comparison. So what if I ask the question, how tall is a person? Well, how can you explain how tall people are? Okay. If I ask the question, well, how tall are people? And I go to an NBA basketball game. Okay. One might have the impression that people are really tall. Okay, because everybody playing basketball is over 6 feet tall. Some of them are over 7 feet tall. Now, if I ask how tall are people, and I go to the Kentucky Derby, okay, jockeys, the people that ride the horses, are generally very short. Okay, the average height of a jockey is 5'2". Okay, because smaller people are lighter and the horse can run faster with a lighter person on their back. Or if you go to like a gymnastics competition, gymnasts are usually pretty small. Okay, because in order to flip and turn and do all the amazing acrobatics, they have to be small and nimble. Okay, so depending on where I go and ask the question, well, how big are people? I'm going to get different results. Okay, so I need some sort of standard. I need some sort of control to say, well, how tall are people really? So instead of going to these places where you have extreme athletes, extreme people, really tall basketball players or really short jockeys, okay, maybe I should go someplace quote-unquote normal. Maybe I should go to like a park where there's just normal people walking around and then start measuring people there. Because I'm going to get a better sense of how tall normal people are. Am I going to come across some tall people? Yes. Am I going to come across some short people? Sure. But everybody else is going to kind of fall into what we would consider an average range. Okay? So when you're doing an experiment, you want to make sure you take into account the fact that especially living organisms vary from person to person, from plant to plant. So if I grow some plants, some flowers using this fertilizer, and those flowers grow 10 centimeters tall, is 10 centimeters good or bad? Well, we don't know. We need to grow some flowers without fertilizer to check. So we can put a plant with fertilizer next to a plant without fertilizer and say which one is taller. Okay. So if I'm growing a plant with this experimental fertilizer and it grows 10 centimeters tall, and the plant without the fertilizer only grows 5 centimeters, well, that implies to you that the plant with the fertilizer is taller. So my results seem positive. It seems to be working. Now, what if my experimental plant with the fertilizer grows 10 centimeters tall, but the one without the fertilizer grows 20 centimeters instead? Well, that tells us different results because of that control, because of that standard to compare my results with. Well, the one without the fertilizer in this case is much bigger than the one with the fertilizer. So maybe something's not working with my fertilizer. Okay, so you have to question the validity of your results. And then everything else in the experiment should stay constant. Now, don't get constants confused with a control. Your constants are everything about your experiment that does not change. Remember, your control is going to be you set some samples aside and say, we're not going to do anything to this. We're just going to let them act normal. Okay? But your constants stay constant for everybody, even the control. So if I'm growing flowers, okay, I need sunlight, I need water, I need soil. Maybe I'm growing them in pots. Okay, so all of those things should stay the same because I don't want anything else confusing my results. Let's say I have some flowers that I'm growing with fertilizer, some flowers I'm not. The flowers with the fertilizer, I water them twice a day, but the ones without fertilizer, I water them 3 times a day. Okay. If one flower grows taller than the other, can I really be certain that my results are accurate? Are they reliable? Well, not necessarily, because if one set of flowers is getting more water than the other, then it could be the water that is changing how tall they're growing rather than the fertilizer. Okay? So we want to make sure that we're only changing that one thing, that independent variable, and everything else stays the same. And again, this makes sure that our tests are more reliable and more valid. And sometimes when you're designing an experiment, you can't anticipate all the changes, all the differences that may occur. If I'm growing a garden outside, I can't necessarily control whether or not it rains. So a scientist might need to take that into account when they're designing their experiment and say, you know what, maybe instead of growing them outside, maybe I should grow them in a greenhouse where I can control whether or not it rains. Okay. All right, so the next question is the formative question. So this kind of question here is something you will see on your first unit test, but you'll definitely see a question like this on the EOC, where we give you an experiment and then we ask you to pick out the pieces of that experiment. Okay? So earthworms will change color with specific diet. A scientist has 2 groups of worms. Group A is fed soil compost. Group B is fed soil compost with added carotene in it. Carotene is a type of protein. You find it in carrots, what makes carrots orange. Okay. The scientists record the observations of the earthworm's color. So the question here is, what is the independent or manipulated variable here? Okay. So You need to be able to look at an experiment and pick out the pieces of that experiment. What's the independent variable? What's the dependent variable? What are constants? What could be a control? So these are factors we need to be able to find in an experiment. So what's the independent variable here? What's the manipulated variable? Is that the soil compost? Is it the carotene? Is it group B? Or is it the worm's observed color? Okay, the last thing to consider here is when we get down to scientific ideas. Okay, so we're doing all this experimentation because we're trying to find out the evidence. And this evidence leads us to scientific ideas. Now, there are basically three kinds of scientific ideas. The first one we've already talked about. That's a hypothesis. Hypothesis, remember, is an educated guess. Okay, this is based on research. It's based on the things that we know from observation, but it's a guess. So when we test that hypothesis, we start gathering evidence. And the more we test it and the more evidence that we have, we can start to say that, yes, these results are accurate. Okay. If you have tested an idea over and over and over and over again, we might start to think of these ideas as either a theory or a law. Now, people get these terms mixed up quite a bit, and part of that is due to the fact that we use these words differently in common everyday language. Okay, so let's say you're a detective and you walk into the scene of a crime. Okay, there is a glass case that has been smashed open and a priceless jewel has been stolen. Okay. Now, as a detective, you might walk in, look around the room, and say, I have a theory of this crime. The reality is you don't have a theory, you have a hypothesis. You have an educated guess. Based on your years of being a detective, based on the fact that the glass case was smashed, the jewelry is missing, okay, you have an idea of what happened. Okay, you look at other evidence, like there's fingerprints, there's a rope dangling from the skylight. It's like, okay, the guy came in from the roof and then smashed the case and ran off with the jewels. Okay, well, that's just a hypothesis. That's a guess. So if you're a detective and you're trying to solve a crime, what do? You collect evidence. Okay, now that you have some evidence, you've gone through, you've done some testing, you've swabbed for DNA samples, you've looked at motives of suspects. Now, once you have some evidence that backs up your idea, now you can say, hey, I think I have a theory. So a theory in science is an idea that has been backed up. It's a well-tested idea. A lot of times scientific theories are accepted as scientific fact, okay, by other scientists. Now, scientists use the word fact very carefully because even though we know a lot of stuff about things, about scientific ideas, doesn't mean we know everything. So a scientist might say this theory is true, but they might say maybe it's 99.99999% true. They're always going to leave a little bit of wiggle room and say, well, what if there's something we don't know yet? What if there's something we haven't discovered? Okay. So a lot of times when we do more experimentation, it just backs up the stuff we already know. But sometimes it really blows our minds. It's like, we have to rethink these ideas, these theories, because now we have something brand new that is causing us to question everything that we know. And that happens from time to time. And sometimes scientists can be very resistant to new ideas because it's like, this is the way we do it. It's the way we've always done it. Okay, but once the evidence piles up, and you say, well, it's kind of hard to deny it at this point because all the data that's telling us this is the way it is. Okay, so a scientific theory is often an idea. It's a combination of all the data, all the evidence, all the observations that we've made about an idea. Okay. And theories often help us explain why something happens. Okay? A scientific law, on the other hand, also backed up by evidence and observation. Laws tend to give us predictions of what, like what will happen, like what will happen next. A lot of times what laws do is they explain patterns in nature. Okay? So generally when we use the word law, we think of like a civil law, like it's against the law to murder someone. It's against the law to drive faster than the speed limit. Okay, those civil laws, basically we make up the rules and then we follow those rules. A scientific law is different. The rules are already there. We just have to observe and understand the rules. So probably most familiar law to most of you is the law of gravity. If you throw something up in the air, it's going to fall back down to the ground. That's an observable pattern that we recognize. Now, if I'm on the International Space Station, throwing something up in the air is going to be different. So we know that gravity changes from one place to another. And that falls into what we call gravitational theory. Okay? So a lot of times laws, the things that we can see, the patterns that we can observe, okay, are part of what explains a theory. Okay? So a lot of times people think, oh, well, ideas go from a hypothesis to a theory to a law. That's not how it works. Okay? A hypothesis can become a theory. A hypothesis can become a law as we gather evidence, but laws and theories don't necessarily become interchangeable. A lot of times, laws help inform our understanding of theories. So what we understand about gravity is greatly informed by the law of gravity. The fact that we throw a rock in the air, it's going to come back down to the ground. That's an observable pattern. It explains what happens and what will happen if we throw a rock in the air. I don't actually have to do it to know what's going to happen next. Okay. Now, based on that law, we can say, okay, why does that happen? And now we have to have a theory to explain the why. Okay. Theories and laws are well accepted by scientists. So scientists kind of nod their head and go, yeah, this is kind of how it is. But they are not set in stone, meaning that if new information comes along and causes us to question these laws, start us questioning these theories, scientists have to be willing to revise and to change, okay, and update. Now, sometimes we're not going to throw things out altogether. Albert Einstein did a lot of experimentation and thinking about gravity. And his ideas about gravity really changed the way we understand gravity, but didn't cause us to throw the law of gravity out the window. It just caused us to add to gravitational theory. So depending on what ideas are out there and what new information comes in, we have to revise our theories, we have to revise our laws, and yes, sometimes we have to throw them out the window and start over again. But more often, the more evidence we collect, the more we can rely on the ideas that we have. A mistake that I see a lot in a science class is we'll come across something and someone will say, oh, well, that's just a theory. Okay. When you say just a theory, that tells me that you don't understand what a theory is. Because if a scientist has a theory, that means we have evidence that backs up this idea. And in this class, one of the ideas that we're going to come across that a lot of people will be like, well, I'm not sure about that, is the theory of evolution. We'll talk about this later on in the year. And there are plenty of people that will tell me, well, I don't believe in evolution because it's just a theory. Well, we can't say that evolution is just a theory because there's evidence to back it up. We've been studying evolution pretty thoroughly for about 150 years, and all the evidence seems to point us in one direction. So when we say the theory of evolution, what we're saying is this is the explanation of how something in nature works to the best of our knowledge. Does that mean that there isn't more information that we can discover? Of course not. There's always more research, always more evidence that we can find. Okay? And scientists are constantly pursuing. Now, does that mean that there won't be some mind-blowing sort of discovery made sometime in the future? Of course not. But as of right now, like when we talk about theories in a science class, what we're really talking about is this is the best that scientists have to offer right now. Okay? It might change, it might improve, but as of our current knowledge, with everything that we know about the world and the universe, this is the best that we can do. Okay? So when we talk about theory versus law, we need to make sure that we understand what we mean. Especially in science, we say, I have a theory. What we're saying is I have an idea that is based on a tremendous amount of evidence. Okay? So scientists can rely on that theory, and they can use that theory. And one of the important things about laws and about theories in particular is how well it can help us predict the outcome of something new. Okay? The best test of a theory is its predictive power. Okay? The theory of evolution, for example, has predicted the existence of organisms, animals, that had not been discovered. One of the important originators of the theory of evolution was a guy named Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin predicted that there would be this certain kind of moth that would exist in the Amazon rainforest. And 50 years after Darwin died, other scientists discovered the exact moth that Darwin described. Okay? Because he had evidence to back up this idea and said, you know what, this is what I think happens, and this is the evidence that supports it, we are able to predict, yes, there should be a moth that lives here and does this and looks like this, and we were able to find that later. So that's the important thing about science, is being able to predict what's going to happen next.